The night my father said those words, my body froze completely before my brain could understand how much hurt one sentence could cause. My name is Haley, and I was 27 years old when I realized that even families that look normal from the outside can hurt you without any warning. Until that moment, I truly believed that family meant safety and that staying quiet meant everything was okay. But I was wrong in a way that felt like it would last forever. I walked into the living room expecting a quick talk about chores, schedules, or things that didn't matter enough to change my whole life. Instead, the air felt tight and planned, like the room itself had already decided that I didn't belong there. Dad looked at me and said, "In this family, you no longer matter." My chest got tight right away while my body froze in place because my gut understood the danger before my thoughts had time to catch up. I looked at him and said, "Say that again slowly." Dad did not wait, and he did not show any feelings because he had already decided that he didn't need to make it sound nicer. He said, "You heard me. We are done pretending you are important here." There was no anger in his voice, and there was no waiting in his tone. That calm way of saying it made the words heavier because quiet meanness doesn't give you space to fight back or room to stand up for yourself. In that silence, I felt something inside me change without my permission. My place in that family was not talked about or discussed. It was erased in a way that felt planned and final. From that moment forward, I stopped trusting the place I had once called home. I stopped believing that being loyal would keep me safe, or that trying hard would make people see me. From that exact moment, I stopped giving them my time, my attention, and my help because I understood that nothing I gave would ever be enough. And just a few days later, they begged me to come back. But I said no. Be honest. If your own family said this to you, would you fight to stay or choose to leave? And how do you think that choice would change your future? Comment your answer. That night, the house did not look different at first, but the normal feeling of belonging disappeared quietly as I moved through each room and felt a pushback that had never been there before. Every step felt slightly wrong. Every small sound carried a heaviness that didn't show itself clearly, and the air around me held a tightness that made even simple movements feel like I was crossing a line that no one wanted to explain. I tried to keep doing my normal things because routine felt safer than fighting. But the way people acted around me changed in small but clear ways that made silence feel louder than old arguments. Voices got softer when I walked into shared rooms. Eye contact disappeared right before it could happen. And rooms that used to feel open began to feel like spaces I was only allowed to borrow for short moments. I kept sitting in the same chair, even when it no longer felt like it belonged to me. My stepmother, Diane Monroe, began moving small things around the house in a way that felt careful rather than helpful. And after that moment, I called her only Diane. She moved things I used every day to places I wouldn't expect, changed shared schedules without telling me, and fixed small habits with a calm control that left no space for talking. Nothing she did looked big from the outside. But doing it over and over carried a purpose that slowly became heavier with time. My younger brother, Ethan Monroe, started pulling away in a way that felt planned instead of emotional. And from that point forward, I thought of him only as Ethan. He stopped looking me in the eyes in narrow hallways, didn't sit near me at meals, and found quiet reasons to leave a room whenever I came in, which made the silence between us feel planned rather than natural. He never said anything mean, but the distance grew in a way that felt practiced over time. Instead of reacting, I moved my focus toward watching and quietly understanding because reacting would have given them control over the feeling in the house, while watching let me stay steady in a place that was becoming tricky. I began to notice timing instead of tone, placement instead of purpose, and patterns instead of apologies, which let me build awareness without showing confusion. I memorized the way quick looks moved when my name was said, the small wait before answers came when I spoke, and the way silence gathered when I stayed in a room slightly too long. A small sense of something hidden began to form behind their behavior, and it felt less connected to me than to something urgent that I couldn't understand yet. Papers stopped showing up in shared areas where they used to be left casually. Doors stayed closed longer than usual without clear reasons, and talks ended suddenly when footsteps got close, which created a pattern that was impossible to ignore. I chose not to ask anyone about it in that moment because I was no longer trying to be understood, and asking questions felt less useful than watching quietly. By the end of that night, I understood that I was no longer part of the emotional rhythm of the house. Not because I had failed in any way, but because the flow of attention had changed without warning or my permission. I did not cry or raise my voice or demand answers because I sensed that answers would not come easily, and forcing them would only give me softer lies instead of hard truth. I stayed still in my own space and watched people slowly get used to a version of the house where my presence was no longer treated as something important or needed. 3 days later, the silence felt organized. By the third morning, the routine inside the house changed into something colder and more planned. Dad moved through shared spaces without looking at me, not in anger or annoyance, but in a way that felt practiced, like my presence no longer needed direct attention. When he spoke, his words aimed past me instead of at me. Short talks about schedules, groceries, or work that never included my opinion or my input. I noticed how his chair turned slightly away from me at the table, not by accident, but through small repeated movements that became part of the setup of the room. That same afternoon, I walked into the living area and realized my personal things were missing. The books I kept by the armchair were gone. The throw blanket I used every evening no longer sat on the couch. Even the small ceramic mug I always used had disappeared from the kitchen cabinet. Diane did not mention the changes, did not ask permission, did not explain the reason, and when I looked at the cleared spaces, I understood the message without needing words. The house was becoming a place where my presence was temporary, even though my name stayed on the family chores. I tested small decisions to see what was still mine to control. I changed the thermostat once and noticed it went back to its old setting within minutes. I moved a chair in the dining area and found it placed back into place later that night. I changed the position of a lamp in the hallway and watched it disappear completely by morning. These were not arguments. There were no raised voices. It was quieter than that. It was done step by step. During dinner on the third evening, I tried to join a talk about weekend plans. Dad did not answer my question. Diane answered as if I had not spoken, describing plans that did not include me without waiting. I watched the way Ethan avoided the edges of my sight, how his fork moved slower whenever I spoke, how he stared at his plate rather than risk eye contact. I felt the lack of direct meanness, which was more unsettling than any open fight, because it meant the decision about my place had already been made final by someone other than me. Later that night, while walking past the home office, I noticed a stack of unopened mail on the corner of the desk. One envelope sat slightly apart from the others, folded in a way that looked rushed. Inside were notices that did not belong to me, statements about overdue bills, a warning about coming deadlines, a letter with bold phrases about account reviews and payment schedules. I did not open everything. I did not need to. The pattern stood out right away, because stress leaves marks even when people believe they have hidden it well. I placed the papers back exactly where they were without messing up their order. But the weight of what I had seen did not leave me. I started connecting small details. Whispered phone calls cut short when I walked into a room, late-night typing sounds from behind closed doors, talks that stopped mid-sentence whenever I got close. No one was trying to scare me. No one wanted a fight. They were trying to keep control while pretending the setup still worked. That understanding settled deeper than fear. I was not losing a place in the family by accident. The system was being redesigned quietly. I could feel the edges of the new setup forming around me, tightening in a way that left no space for talking. I stopped trying to fix anything. I stopped asking where I fit. I started watching what they protected, what they hid, and what they feared becoming visible. The silence no longer felt empty. It felt engineered. A week passed without arguments, only rearrangements. I started to pull myself out of every unnecessary interaction with the people inside that house. Not because I felt weak, but because I realized that watching required distance, silence, discipline, and emotional control that I had never practiced before that moment. I stopped offering opinions. I stopped volunteering information. I stopped correcting misunderstandings. Instead, I watched patterns, tracked reactions, measured pauses in conversations, and memorized how each person behaved when they thought I was no longer paying attention. This change did not feel big, but it felt planned, like stepping back from a hot surface before the damage became visible on my skin. My focus moved away from the idea of fixing anything that had already been damaged. Work became my main structure, not as an escape, but as a place where results were honest, rules were steady, and hard work created clear results. I stayed longer after closing hours. I volunteered for tasks that others didn't want. I listened more during meetings and spoke only when I knew my words would not be dismissed. For the first time in a long while, I felt that my presence had a clear value somewhere, even if it was not inside the walls of my own home. While organizing old folders on my laptop, I began noticing money movements that had once felt small. Small transfers became large when placed in a timeline. Occasional help turned into a pattern of steady support. I saw records of shared bills, emergency payments, quiet deposits, and expenses that I had never added up as part of my burden because I had been told that everyone was carrying equal weight. The numbers told a different story. The quiet sacrifices told a different story. The silence around those sacrifices finally started to make sense. I opened a private notebook and began writing down everything that belonged only to me. Account details, access codes, forgotten passwords, work benefits that had never been explained clearly, legal papers that sat untouched in shared drawers. I tracked the flow of money. I studied spending patterns. I created order where mess had once been acceptable. This was not about revenge. This was about clarity. For the first time, I knew exactly where I stood financially, mentally, and structurally inside my own life. During that week, I met with my best friend, Natalie Brooks. She listened without interrupting, without offering big solutions, without pushing me toward decisions I was not ready to make. She did not try to fix me. She did not defend anyone. She simply let the space belong to me for once. That single talk stayed with me more than any argument ever had because it showed me what calm support looked like without conditions or expectations attached. As the days passed, my internal reaction to the house changed again. I stopped feeling invisible. I stopped feeling erased. I began feeling detached. Being detached brought clarity. Clarity brought control. Control brought peace that did not depend on approval. I understood that I was no longer moving inside the system they had built for me. I was designing my own structure quietly, privately, without asking permission from anyone who once believed they could write my role for me. I did not confront them. I did not announce changes. I did not demand recognition. I simply became someone they could no longer read easily. That week did not look dramatic from the outside, but internally it was the week I stopped trying to be understood by people who had already decided I was unnecessary. 2 weeks later, I stopped asking for space and started creating it. I made my first real move, quietly without announcements or emotional preparation, because I understood that freedom works best when no one has time to interfere. I opened a personal bank account that only carried my name, using a different branch, a different email, a different phone number. I did not ask permission. I did not explain. I did not feel guilty. For the first time, something in my life belonged to me completely without shared access, without questions, without silent expectations attached to every dollar that passed through it. After that step, I built a money plan that belonged only to me. I studied my income in a different way, not as money meant to support a household that no longer respected me, but as something I could design a future with. I broke my expenses into groups, tracked them over time, guessed risks, prepared for emergencies. This was not about greed, and it was not about fear. It was about refusing to stay dependent on a system that had already decided I was disposable. I started seeing my time as money, my skills as power, and my energy as something that deserved careful protection. Inside the house, Diane began to change. Her questions became sharper. Her eyes stayed on me longer. Her tone changed when I walked past. She started asking vague questions about documents, receipts, cards, bank letters that never actually existed. She tried to catch me off guard by asking things in front of others, hoping I would wait or show something without realizing it. I did not react. I did not argue. I did not confirm or deny anything. She had no proof, no access, no control over what I had already separated. Her suspicion stayed trapped inside her, growing without direction, because power becomes useless when it cannot touch what matters. At work, a new presence slowly entered my daily routine. My coworker Eric Vaughn became part of my environment through projects, meetings, deadlines, shared responsibilities. He was calm in a way that did not demand attention, focused in a way that did not feel threatening. He listened before speaking. He noticed details without making them feel heavy. These interactions did not feel dramatic. They felt stable. For the first time in a long while, I worked beside someone who treated me as capable without needing to prove anything. That simple professionalism changed the way I thought about respect because it showed me how light it could feel when it was real. As my independence grew, my understanding of family began to change in ways I did not expect. Family stopped meaning shared walls, shared meals, shared history that was used as power. I began to think of it as alignment instead of blood, safety instead of obligation, consistency instead of promises spoken only when convenient. I stopped measuring love by sacrifice because sacrifice had only made me smaller in that house. I started measuring connection by the lack of fear, by the presence of trust, by the feeling that I could exist without shrinking my voice or hiding my impact. By the end of those 2 weeks, I no longer felt like someone waiting to be accepted. I felt like someone designing a structure that no one could quietly tear down. I spent less time explaining myself. I spent less time defending my decisions. I spent more time building layers around my energy, my money, my future. It was not visible to anyone watching from the outside, but inside me, something had locked into place. I was no longer asking to be seen. I was deciding who deserved access. 1 month in, my name started to matter somewhere else. At work, things changed in a quiet but real way. My boss stopped correcting my reports and started forwarding them, which felt small on paper but heavy in meaning because it was the first time someone trusted my judgment without attaching conditions or reminders. I was given responsibility over a small internal process. Nothing dramatic, nothing public yet. It marked a real change in how I was seen. For the first time in a long while, my value was recorded instead of questioned. At home, the tone changed for different reasons. Dad began asking questions that sounded casual, but carried a strange weight, mostly about paperwork, billing letters, or documents that needed to be organized. Diane followed his lead soon after, bringing folders into shared spaces and placing them close enough for me to notice, but not close enough to touch. They did not ask directly for help, but their eyes kept returning to me in a way that felt calculated, like they were measuring how far they could push without admitting they needed me. The money cracks became harder to ignore as the days moved forward. Unopened envelopes collected in small piles. Digital payment reminders appeared on the shared devices longer than usual, and the tone between them changed from confident to short. I did not step in. I did not offer solutions. I stayed where I was, watching how long it would take before they understood what silence actually felt like when it belonged to them. I started noticing how much effort I used to spend keeping everything together, filling gaps nobody ever thanked me for filling. That understanding did not make me angry. It made me exact. I began scheduling my time around my own priorities, treating my energy like a limited resource rather than something that existed for family maintenance. Their chaos was no longer something I felt required to manage. Moments began to surface where my absence created visible confusion. A missed form here, a misunderstood deadline there, small failures that used to be invisible because I absorbed them quietly. This time I did nothing except watch how lost they became without me correcting their mistakes behind closed doors. I felt a strange calm settle into my routine. Not happiness, not revenge, just clarity. The kind that comes when you stop trying to be seen by people who only notice you when their world starts breaking. I understood without needing proof that they were finally learning the cost of never valuing the person who held their system together. Then everything broke without a warning. The first crack showed up in paperwork, not in voices. I noticed unfamiliar envelopes stacked near the entry table, marked with bold lettering from financial agencies that did not use friendly language or patient formatting, which immediately told me that whatever happened in this house was now visible to the outside world in a way that could not be controlled. That was when I first learned what Ethan had been hiding. He had built up serious credit card debt and personal loans under his own name with legal paperwork that left no space for denial or confusion because the files carried clear account numbers, original signatures, and repayment terms that had already been broken. I did not confront him because at this stage, watching felt more valuable than reacting. Within days, the house stopped feeling private. Recovery agents started appearing at the front gate, speaking in firm, professional tones that stayed just polite enough to stay legal, but cold enough to make the message impossible to ignore. They came with folders, case numbers, and quiet threats of further action, creating a pressure that lived in the air long after they left, which changed the rhythm of the home in a way no argument ever had. Dad felt it before anyone admitted it out loud. He started moving through the house like a guest instead of a figure of authority, avoiding long pauses near unopened mail, avoiding conversations that required decisions, avoiding direct eye contact when certain words were mentioned.